Hi, I'm Unlearning Economics, and I bloody love a cup of coffee. But lately, it feels like coffee shops have really taken over the high street. Coffee used to be just for Italians and pretentious weirdos, but now everyone needs their cup of joe a day. The question I want to ask in this video is, first, have we really moved to a coffee economy? Or is it just an illusion created by the visibility of discarded coffee cups and urban hipsters like myself? Second, what does the answer to the first question say about our economic model? British people are often associated with tea, and we do like it. When someone comes to my house, the first thing I'll offer them is a cup of tea, even if they've broken in. We actually have a longer history of coffee consumption than people realise. The first UK cafe was reportedly established in Oxford in 1650, with another opening in London just 2 years later. By the late 17th century, there may have been as many as 3,000 of them. Men would meet to discuss business, politics, and literature, and they were sometimes even called penny universities after the price of entry. Cafes declined over the Industrial Revolution as tea became more popular, and coffee got a reputation as a drink for posh ponces. But as disposable incomes rose in the late 20th century, they came back. And giants like Starbucks soon arrived in the UK.
I'd like to get my ear pierced.
Well, better make it quick, kiddo. In 5 minutes, this place is becoming a Starbucks.
Coffee consumption has continued to grow in the UK over my lifetime, and recently, the proportion of people who drink coffee regularly overtook the proportion that drink tea regularly. The expansion in the number of coffee shops is one of the more reliable stats here because it's verifiable with your eyes. According to Project Café, the number of branded outlets in the UK has jumped from 5,781 in 2014 to 12,313 in 2026. And that's before you count the independents. Starbucks arrived in the UK in 1998. Costa Coffee was the homegrown response, and Caffè Nero completed what people call the Big Three. Perhaps more strikingly, chains like McDonald's and Greggs have started serving coffee. It's easy to forget how odd that would have seemed 20 years ago. Greggs, the home of the pasty and the sausage roll, is now the UK's #1 coffee chain by outlet count, having overtaken Costa this year. So the place where you get the cheap, hearty food of the working class is now selling the drink of the posh ponces. What a world. In 2017, the researcher Jennifer Ferreira used the term cafe economy to describe how the high street had seemingly been taken over by cafes and similar venues. Ferreira notes that after the global financial crisis in 2008, most industries suffered, especially on the high street. As demand and credit dried up, quite a few businesses had no choice but to board up their windows. Yet as time went on and the UK economy recovered, very gradually it must be noted, the cafe sector found itself growing year on year in a way most businesses were not. It seems that, at a time when incomes were falling and people were losing their jobs, a trip to a coffee shop became seen as an affordable treat, perhaps replacing a holiday, fancy clothes, or a new margarita machine.
Wow, the new Margaritaville with salsa dispenser!
Even as the high street has declined, with overall retail contracting by about 1/3, more and more coffee shops are being created on net every year. Cafes are one of the only high street industries reliably expanding their presence, and this is noticeable for anyone walking down the street in London. They're everywhere. The cafe is especially suited to the 21st century. In 2015, the author Douglas McWilliams noticed the increasing prevalence of people working on their laptops in coffee shops. He called this the flat white economy, rather than the cafe economy. And although the sector suffered over the pandemic, the flat white economy moniker arguably works even better in the modern era of working from home.
Can I get you anything?
No, thanks, I'm good.
I'm sure I can't get you anything at all.
Between 2022 and 2025, during the cost of living crisis, the number of people buying coffee outside the home every week rose from 13 to 15% of the population. It's especially suited for creatives like myself, even though I don't do it because I can't afford it. There are benefits to a cafe economy. People on social media have been talking a lot about third spaces recently, places that are neither the workplace nor the home, and coffee shops fit this well. You could go there to sit and hang out, to take your children, to meet friends, to work by yourself, or to talk business like the 17th century Oxford denizens. Cafes have been shown to provide a boost to local economies. Their presence can jumpstart a shopping location by allowing people to hang out in an area for longer. For this reason, local councils from East Yorkshire to Northern Ireland have encouraged the development of a cafe culture in their towns. And unlike pubs, they're open all day, and you can bring kids. Then there is the final, most important factor to consider, which is that cafes look quite nice. Having lots of nice cafes dotted around is by no means a bad thing. But I must confess, this kind of coffee economy has always confused me. It was one of the first things that confused me about the economy 20 years ago when I first started thinking about it, and it still does today. How can everybody just work in a bar or a coffee shop, then, during their time off, go and sit in a coffee shop or a bar? There's a circularity to the whole thing. It seems like there's no there. Everyone's just swanning around on their laptops.
The world's just people walking around, going into rooms and saying things.
Or is this just a grumpy old man's view that laments that the kids are in coffee shops instead of the mines? Everyone knows the children yearn for the mines. Here's the big reveal. My point in this video is broader than just coffee or even cafes. It applies to the entire hospitality sector, cafes, restaurants, pubs. It also applies, arguably even more so, to the gig economy, Uber, Deliveroo, warehouse work and Amazon drivers. You see, what I'm really talking about here is not an economy built around cafes as such, but an economy built around service. And not highbrow services like lawyers, accountants or YouTubers. I mean people doing things that, for the most part, you could feasibly do yourself. No disrespect to anyone with these jobs, this is just the way the world works right now. But wait, has even this broader sector come to dominate the UK economy? Well, no. The Office for National Statistics has shown that the share of income families spend on eating out in general is roughly constant over time. This includes cafes, restaurants, pubs, and also takeaways, any food made outside the home. You can see this in red on the graph. In 1985, eating out was just under 8% of total family spending, and now it's just over 8%. In blue, real catering output did rise somewhat. Watch out, there are two y-axes here and we're now looking at the right-hand one. But a lot of the growth has been nominal, which is shown by the grey dotted line. This is why all the marketing reports are like, the coffee sector is growing X% every year, even though its growth is actually quite tame after adjusting for inflation. In summary, it's not like the industry is dominating, blue, and it's not like households are eating out all the time now, red. The spending and revenue figures are solid, but modest. So, despite the real and visible takeover of high streets by cafes and the like, plus the visible rise of Deliveroo and Uber, we're not dealing with market dominance of the broader eating out industry. So is the title of this video just a lie? No, I'd never do that to you. It turns out that there is actually something which ties the coffee shops and the mines together. Speaking of coffee, buy me coffee, or subscribe to my Patreon, or become a YouTube member. This channel is entirely fan-funded with no sponsors, so I rely on your money to keep going. Please, enable me to sit on my laptop and work in a coffee shop so that I don't lose my mind working from home. This place is known as Greece. They've done a lot of good stuff like Halloumi, the Olympics, the Parthenon, Cool Myths and Gods, winning the 2004 Euros, and Civilization. They've also done some bad stuff like when I went to Crete on holiday when I was 7 and we complained about the food and the chef came out screaming and said that he'd throw me in the river. My Greek friends say this was just his way of apologising, but I didn't sleep that night. Oh, and the Greeks also did quite a lot of slavery back in the day. Whomst among us. Greece's economy is infamous for quite how screwed over they got by the financial crisis and the ensuing Eurozone crisis. When the global economy collapsed in 2008, Greece's GDP fell quite quickly. But what would turn out to be a bigger problem for the Greek people was the government budget deficit, the amount the Greek state was borrowing every year. This was forecast to be around 3% before the crisis, but spiked up to 15% after it. The powers that be concluded that Greece needed to make significant cuts to spending, as well as tax increases, in order to balance the budget. Greece's public debt situation was complicated by a few unfortunate factors. Firstly, they didn't only have a government deficit, but a current account deficit. That is, They were importing far more than they were exporting. These twin deficits meant that the government was borrowing money from international markets at the same time that businesses and consumers were spending money outside of the country. This creates a lot of imbalances in the economy, to say the least, and means that investors are unlikely to have confidence in the country. To put it bluntly, you're basically borrowing money from global markets with nothing to offer them in return. Secondly, Greece is a member of the Eurozone, which means that it does not control its own currency. Typically, when a government is spending a lot of money, the central bank can step in and print money to buy the government debt. This helps to stabilise the markets and gives the government a bit of leeway. Of course, there are limits to this process too, but by virtue of being in the euro, Greece could not do this at all. The currency was in the hands of the European Central Bank, whose policies depend on looking at other countries at the same time. Even worse, they explicitly stated that they were not going to help Greece directly. What was implemented was a package which promised to make Greece more competitive, often referred to as a structural adjustment program, which does sound like a torture method and kind of is. These reforms generally focus on a few things. First, reduction or elimination of labour rights, including unemployment benefits, job protections, pensions, and training. Second, cutting government spending and social services. Third, privatisation of government-owned firms. Fourth, increases in certain kinds of taxes deemed to be more efficient than other kinds of taxes. More on that later. Fifth, reductions of tariffs and limits on the movement of capital to encourage international trade and money flows. Sixth, deregulation of finance and other businesses. You don't need to memorise all of this, just to realise that it's a standard free market package. Deregulation, privatisation, less cumbersome taxes and tariffs, and above all, huge cuts to government spending. The idea was that by removing various barriers to doing business, the economy would thrive. Get the cumbersome state out of the way, and you'd quickly find that markets would work better at allocating resources so investment was boosted, increasing innovation, and the adoption of new technologies. There will be short-term pain, granted, but this will eventually give way to a revitalised, growing economy. It should be emphasised that Greece really did these reforms, a lot and all at once. It was unprecedented how much they embraced the structural adjustment package. Any idea that they didn't pursue these reforms properly, this wasn't true austerity, is completely ridiculous. As you can see from the left-hand graph, government spending fell a huge amount following 2009, and at its nadir was almost 1/3 of where it was at its peak. At the same time, the total tax take increased by about 10% of GDP, with most of the increase coming from taxes on products and imports, which are known as indirect taxes. An example of an indirect tax is the sales tax, which falls on consumers rather than on labour or capital. Economists generally believe indirect taxes are more efficient because they don't tax production, but indirect taxes also hurt the poor more. Since Greece is in the Eurozone, another crucial thing it was hoped these reforms would do was to create internal devaluation. You see, usually when a country is importing more than it exports, or when it's just in a general economic slump, its exchange rate should decline relative to the rest of the world. This should hopefully boost exports as they become relatively cheaper for foreigners, while also reducing imports because foreign goods are now more expensive for Greeks. That should deal with the current account deficit, which along with the other cuts can solve the twin deficits in one fell swoop. The problem is that when you don't have an exchange rate, you can't do this. Greece could not reduce its exchange rate relative to the rest of the Eurozone countries, its main trading partners. So they had to do what's called a pro-gamer move and manually lower wages and prices across the entire Greek economy. Wow, who could have predicted that all of this would be a disaster? GDP fell by almost 1/4 and stagnated for a decade, which is an unbelievable decline, one of the deepest peacetime declines any rich country has seen since the 1930s. Even today, Greek GDP is still below its pre-crisis level. Employment also dipped severely, both the number of persons employed in blue and hours worked in orange, but it has rebounded more so. That disparity between GDP and employment might seem like a minor quirk of the data, but it's more important for this video than you might first think. Keep it in mind. Zooming in from the big picture, it may not surprise you to learn that, in practice, these reforms were contradictory and kind of corrupt. As former US President Barack Obama said,
I noticed that they being German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French former President Nicolas Sarkozy, rarely mentioned that German and French banks were some of Greece's biggest lenders, or that much of Greece's accumulated debt had been racked up. by buying German and French exports.
So the twin deficits both seem to benefit the richer Eurozone countries. Greece owed money to French and German banks, and it also spent money on French and German cars and electronics. And which countries do you think held more sway with the European authorities? Even within Greece, the reforms tried to shore up the banking sector with more financial capital. As this cushion was more affordable for larger banks, smaller ones fell by the wayside, and the Greek banking sector is now more concentrated than it's ever been. This is despite the fact that the reforms ostensibly aim to increase competition, remember? The same goes for the Greek energy sector, more concentrated than ever. As Joseph Stiglitz has documented, this whole package was really designed around satisfying creditors rather than benefiting the Greek people. The creditors may have been foreign or they may have been domestic, but the average person was expected to lower their standard of living to bail them out. One of the neatest examples of this revolves around credit default swaps. This may be a technical point, but it is extremely telling in my opinion. CDSs are a kind of insurance. They pay out a lender if that lender doesn't get their money back. So with Greek government bonds, which were always risky, you could take out a CDS, and if the Greek government did default, you get your money back. The point of having this financial alchemy is that across the whole system, the risks balance out. If there's a default, then some lose, but they likely have insurance, so the losses are shared. Makes sense, no? Unfortunately, according to Joseph Stiglitz, the European Central Bank weirdly insisted that when Greece was in trouble, the CDSs were not allowed to be triggered. So the insurance wasn't allowed to insure. It's like your car got broken into and the insurance company just refused to pay out. Imagine. It turns out that it was generally smaller banks in Greece who had taken the sensible measure of buying credit default swaps to protect themselves in the event of a default. The larger banks had actually been selling CDSs, and they didn't want to pay out. In other words, the larger banks had made a gamble that didn't pay off, but they weren't allowed to lose from it. Who was affected? Smaller banks, the Greek government, and above all the Greek people. All because of an arbitrary intervention by the European authorities that stopped the big banks taking any losses for their poor decisions. The resultant social suffering of all this is well documented. Incomes fell, many lost their jobs, and households became indebted. Poverty and material deprivation rose substantially, as did health issues, mental health issues, and the public sector, from pensions to health to education, has been completely gutted. There were riots in Athens. It's hard to overstate the scale of devastation to Grecian society. One of my former students worked in the health sector in Greece, and she said that in some parts, a hospital is basically just a room with a bed and a doctor, and you have to bring your own sheets and medicine. That's not a hospital. With all this said, you may be wondering what this has to do with coffee. Well, like many Mediterranean countries, Greece has long had a thriving cafe sector. But after the initial pain of structural adjustment wore off and the powers that be reached some limited compromises and wrote off some Greek debt, the country's economy started to recover. This took over a decade and it's still got some way to go. But in recent years, a few observers have even started to celebrate the Greek economy's return to normal. As one important study noted, between 2009 and 2023, only two sectors of the Greek economy grew substantially: real estate and accommodation and food service activities, or AFSA. The latter is what we're interested in. The value added by AFSA, shown in blue, fell during the financial crisis and also during the pandemic. Today, it is back to around its pre-pandemic level and way above its pre-2008 level, even though the overall economy is not. This implies that the food sector has grown as a share of the Greek economy. I said to remember employment earlier, and the figures for output are nothing in comparison to these figures. Employment in AFSA, shown in orange, is much higher than it was pre-crisis as a share of the total Greek economy. The same goes for employees in green, which excludes self-employed people and rises faster. Don't worry too much about that difference here. You see, while we might all enjoy a cup of coffee at a cafe from time to time, the modern accommodation and food service activities sector is what's called a low productivity one. With the sector expanding and employment rising much faster than value added, the output per employee is stagnant or even falling. This speaks to a sector that is itself growing, but is hardly an engine of growth for the rest of the economy. The sector just doesn't produce that much value added because, well, it's serving people coffee. Naturally, the story isn't great for the employees either. The hope of the structural adjusters that wages would fall came true. The blue line shows that average Grecian wages have been falling for 15 years and are now below where they were before the millennium. And nowhere has felt this more than AFSA, which the orange line shows has seen a frankly absurd drop of 60% in real wages. Part-time employment also rose over the same period, mostly for people who didn't want part-time jobs. Employment in high-skilled occupations dropped, while employment in low-skilled occupations rose. Because of the target audience for this video, I do want to make the caveat that categories such as high-skilled and low productivity are not value judgments, although they are literally derived from statistics called value added, so I can see why you'd think that. Value added is just market value in an economy. It's nothing to do with a person's inherent worth or how much they contribute to society broadly. It's a narrow measure based on economic efficiency. As the Greek crisis itself showed, those in high-skilled occupations like bankers and policymakers can cause a lot more damage than those in low-skilled occupations. The baristas and delivery drivers didn't crash the economy, then mismanage it for another 10 years. What you can't ignore are the overall dynamics here. Putting the immediate, catastrophic fallout of the Greek structural adjustment programs to one side, the long-term fallout is monumental on its own. This shift to low-wage, part-time work in a sector where growth prospects are limited is bad for the workers who end up in it through no fault of their own, with shitty conditions and reduced wages. But it is also bad for the economy as a whole, because it does not fuel the sectors where sustained growth, productivity gains, and technological innovation take place. Coffee has always had cultural significance for Greece, but as this study notes, these days there's been a bit of a shift.
Greece remained a major international tourist destination, benefiting from the continued global expansion of the tourism sector. Moreover, domestic demand for services such as coffee remained relatively inelastic, reflecting its deep cultural significance. Indeed, for many unemployed individuals, visiting a cafe served as a form of low-cost social activity.
There are echoes of the UK situation here. Traditional demand for cafes remains, but many who wouldn't have always frequented cafes now do so because it's the only treat they can afford. This was buoyed by a rise in tourists who also tend to eat out. Remember, the only sector growing faster than food in Greece is real estate. We'll come back to that dynamic later. For now, there is a very real sense in which what has happened in Greece has been an outright reversal of what we consider economic development. This place is known as Brazil. They do some really great things like pau de queijo, Carnival, winning all the World Cups, being good looking, the Amazon rainforest, and lions. They also do some not so great things like abolishing slavery late, cutting down the Amazon rainforest, and, well, if you've ever been in a relationship with a Brazilian person, I don't need to explain it to you. Brazil also happens to be where a lot of the coffee in the world comes from. It produces almost 3.5 million tons of what's called green coffee. That's unroasted beans, or the raw material for drinkable coffee. Brazil is responsible for almost 1/3 of global coffee output, and the next is Vietnam, clocking in at almost 2 million tons. In general, it's fair to say that most of our coffee beans come from poorer countries across the world, and they usually come from poorer people within those countries. There's no reason for us to pay the people who produce our coffee, after all, with the result that those who grow it get 1 penny for every £2.50 cup. £2.50. This infographic is from 2019. You can see here that the actual coffee costs 10p, while the milk costs the same. The disposable cups and stuff cost almost twice the raw ingredients, yet even taken together, the ingredients for the actual cup of coffee total less than 1/5 of the end price. The farmers and other producers in poor countries get barely anything, while the lion's share goes towards rent, profits, taxes, and staff in the rich countries. This relates back to the idea of third spaces and the cafe economy that we spoke about early on. Most of what you're buying isn't really the coffee, but the environment and the location, access to spaces and to other people. As analyst Michael Schaefer put it,
Whilst coffee is a tradable commodity, a latte in a coffee shop is not. Most of what you're paying for in any market is the space that you're in and the expertise of the staff making the product, along with the value of the brand relative to other products.
this doesn't justify the resultant distribution of wealth, but it does explain it. Of course, being a Financial Times article, this does consult some people who do think it justifies the resultant distribution of wealth.
Experts argue that not only does roasting turn green coffee beans into something that is drinkable, roasters spend time and money finding and blending the coffee that fit the flavour demands of their customers. There's a major research and development cost to understand the flavour preferences of different customers, says Dan Weber, founder of Specialty Roaster Chimney Fire Coffee.
Ooh, finding the right flavours is so difficult. Yeah, so it's fucking your mum, but still do it. Look, even if you times the amount farmers were paid by 10, end consumers would barely notice. If you times the wholesale price by 10, as in everybody involved in making the actual coffee, mostly from poorer countries, end consumers would notice. But the increase would be far less than what's happened over the last few years, and if you ate a bit into the rents of landlords, the slices taken by middlemen, and the profits of multinational corporations, it would be eminently affordable. This is what I was getting at when I said there's no there in the coffee economy. When the actual stuff is exported from poorer countries at low prices, it provides a partial explanation for how everyone can just swan around in coffee shops in rich countries. If you're thinking something like, haha, silly leftist, you can't just engineer prices, they're set by the market. Well, first, you're on the wrong channel. Seriously though. Supply and demand are theoretical concepts. They're not divine ordinances that justify whatever is happening in the economy at this particular moment in time. You want to tell me the global economy is a perfectly calculating machine when the entire system has been upended by not one, not two, but three, can't do three with my fingers, 3 crises in just a few years. That's really painful. If so, I've got a cup of coffee to sell you. It's empty. If poorer countries had more organised workers and farmers and small businesses, or if their politicians had an equal footing in the international institutions where trade deals are made, or if the Brazilian slaves had succeeded in the Revolta de Males, we'd be looking at a very different global economic structure. What's really striking is that, aside from being the source of so much green coffee, Brazil is a perfect case study for the general point I'm making in this video. Much of our economy is based on insecure, poorly paid and low productivity labour. This could apply to a barista, a Deliveroo cyclist, a coffee picker, a Brazilian trucker, a dockyard worker, a pedicab driver, a food stand operator, or even someone begging for money. Dutch sociologist Jan Breman once called these workers wage hunters and gatherers, which reflects the mobile, transitory, and poverty-stricken nature of their existence. This vision of the economy relates to a famous model of how economies grow and develop known as the Lewis model. Arthur Lewis was from St. Lucia and is one of the only economists from a poorer country to win the Nobel Prize. It's also one of the only prizes awarded for work about poorer countries. Go figure. Lewis came up with a famous dual-sector framework for economic development. According to this theory, pre-growth countries were dominated by an informal sector which consisted of those wage hunters and gatherers. Lewis primarily used the idea of a farm, where additional people could be employed, but it would barely increase productivity. Hence the title of his article, Economic Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labour. I reread the original paper for this video and it is really worth a look. It's engaging and contains some lucid reflections on not just economic development, but broader questions about economics. Sticking to the model Lewis put forward, the basic idea is simple enough. In a developing economy, you have two worlds running side by side. One is the traditional sector. Think subsistence farming, street vending, casual labour, where there are more people than there is productive work for them to do. Add another person to a small family farm and you might not increase output at all. Lewis called this surplus labour. These workers aren't exactly unemployed, they're chronically underemployed, scratching together a living however they can. According to Lewis, there was a tendency at the time to ignore this traditional sector, which led to faulty analysis of poorer countries. The other world is what Lewis called the capitalist sector. Factories, modern industry, formal employment. Wages are paid, productivity is higher, and growth is actually possible. The theory goes that as this sector expands, it draws workers out of the traditional sector by offering them a reliable wage. The surplus labour gradually gets absorbed. Productivity rises across the whole economy. Eventually, if the process runs its course, the pool of surplus labour dries up, wages start to rise properly, and the country develops. This is supposed to be the story of industrialisation, and it's a decent approximation of what happened in Britain during the 19th century, in Japan in the 20th, and in South Korea and Taiwan after that. The transformation is what Lewis himself called the central problem in the theory of economic development. When he wrote his famous paper in 1954, Arthur Lewis was actually at the University of Manchester, which is where I graduated from. Naturally, we reviewed this model in depth in my studies. It is a very good example, to my mind, of a model which is still useful, even if it is not to be taken too literally. No, the wage in poor countries isn't at exactly subsistence level. It rises over time, even in the insecure, flexible, non-capitalist sector. Brazilians now are generally better off than 30 years ago. No, the productivity of workers in the informal sector isn't exactly zero. Lots of statistical evidence fails to find support for such a specific assumption. Above all, no, there aren't exactly two sectors of the economy, capitalist and non-capitalist, modern and traditional. Firms like Deliveroo and Uber are surely capitalist, yet they rely on a pool of insecure, low-paid labour which is reminiscent of Lewis' subsistence sector. Still, Lewis effectively drew attention to the widespread phenomenon of underemployment, concentrated in poorer countries. He managed to highlight the productive part of the economy as something novel and different, instead of just assuming it was the norm. He introduced the idea of two distinct sectors of the economy, which is likely true in rich and in poor countries, and even across the globe as a whole. The notion of dualism remains an extremely powerful lens in development economics up until this day. My view is that the best way to understand the Lewis model in today's economy is to take seriously its focus on labour and employment. It's no coincidence that Lewis' exposition is at its most lucid when he speaks of these labourers.
The workers on the docks, the young men who rush forward asking to carry your bag as you appear, the jobbing gardener and the like. These occupations usually have a multiple of the number that they need, each of them earning very small sums from occasional employment. Frequently their number could be halved without reducing output in this sector. Petty retail trading is also exactly of this type. It is enormously expanded in overpopulated economies. Each trader makes only a few sales. Markets are crowded with stalls, and if the number of stalls were greatly reduced, the consumers would be no whit worse off. They might even be better off, since the retail margins might fall.
This has been a theme throughout this video. How has employment stayed high in Greece despite the declines in income? It's precisely because the informal sector has grown, if you define that informal sector by insecure, low-paid, low-productivity labour. This is as opposed to whether the employers are truly capitalist. The high-productivity sector has declined in Greece, and this has been bad for everyone, except for the richer Greeks, or the richer countries in the Eurozone, or the richer people within the richer countries in the Eurozone. The one major critique I'd have of Lewis is that I doubt he foresaw the process he described, the formal sector gradually absorbing the informal sector, as going backwards. Remember when I said that the Greek model was development in reverse? This is it. The informal sector has grown, while the high productivity sector has shrunk. Wages have fallen, GDP has fallen, but employment has rebounded. In that study reviewing the Greek structural adjustment programs earlier, and calling it a café economy, the authors explicitly link the Grecian economy to the Lewis model. But the model was originally intended for poor countries trying to grow, not rich countries shrinking. For Brazilians, development going backwards, or at least stalling, is nothing new. They've long struggled with getting a foothold in the productive sector. One example of such a sector with high potential for growth is, of course, manufacturing. Brazil hugely expanded its manufacturing sector between 1960 and 1980, over which time GDP per person increased by 140%. Had it continued its earlier, high rate of growth, it would be richer than some European nations today. In reality, 20 years after this, Brazilian GDP had increased by only 20% as the country's industry flatlined. Brazil was once a leader in both vehicles and electronics, and although these industries remain, they are nowhere near the powerhouses they once promised to be. Instead, the Brazilian economy remains one where growth and productivity are low, and most employment is insecure and poorly paid. And it's not just Brazil. This applies across a wide range of countries both within Latin America and outside of it. For example, India's economy has long been billed as a rising star, an unusual example of skipping the manufacturing stage and going straight into advanced services. Now, India has grown in recent years and boasts some impressive universities and technological achievements, including their satellite mission to Mars. But 9 out of 10 jobs created between 1991 and 2019 were in informal, unreliable work, like the unlicensed taxi drivers that transport tourists around Delhi for minimal pay. It's therefore not ridiculous to claim that this is the norm for a lot of people in the global economy, while solid, permanent, well-paid, secure jobs with benefits like those traditionally in manufacturing in the West are the anomaly. I actually use the term Brazilianization because it was the one chosen by the Brazilian analyst Alex Hochuli. It means modern but not modern enough, facing relative stagnation in an economy which is nowhere near on track to join the ranks of the industrialized rich countries. In fact, Hochuli's own description is too good not to quote.
The West's evolution finds its mirror image in the original country of the future, the nation doomed forever to remain the country of the future, the one that never reaches its destination. Brazil. The Brazilianization of the world is our encounter with a future denied, and in which this frustration has become constitutive of our social reality. While the closing of historical horizons has often been a leftist, indeed Marxist concern, the sense that things don't work as they should is now widely shared across the political spectrum. Welcome to Brazil. Here, the only people satisfied with their situation are financial elites and venal politicians. Everyone complains, but everyone shrugs their shoulders. This slow degradation of society is not so much a runaway train, but more of a jittery roller coaster, occasionally holding out promise of ascent, yet never breaking free from the tracks. We always come back to where we started, shaken and disoriented, haunted by what we might have been.
I don't know about you, but this is really starting to sound like my own country. This place is known as the United Kingdom. They do some really great stuff like queuing, humour, general cultural impact, universities, countryside, and subtlety. They also do some not so great things like melanin, reality TV, food, repressing their emotions, and pioneering colonialism and slavery in the first place. The United Kingdom has experienced a rise in its cafe economy. It has also experienced harsh austerity measures which only look reasonable in comparison to Greece. Starting in 2010 with the coalition government, we embarked on a dramatic experiment. The government engaged in the largest spending cuts in the UK for decades, arguing that Britain's problems were caused by public spending. As in Greece, this is kind of puzzling given the banking crash was created by the private sector. In addition, UK government borrowing was quite low before the recession. It grew as a result of the decline in tax revenues and rise in benefit spending that always accompanies a slump. People are out of work, so they're not paying money into the system, but are instead receiving money from it. Straightforward. Occasionally on the internet, you will see someone claim that we didn't have austerity over the 2010s. This graph shows real government spending per person in thousands of pounds, and you can see that pre-pandemic it had definitely declined. Some areas were safeguarded to an extent, but this was mostly health and pensions. When you take out these areas, which tend to benefit the elderly, there were huge cuts to specific budgets. Local councils saw central government funding cut by up to 80%. 600 police stations have shut. 1 in 4 bus services across England have disappeared while fares have gone up. 1 in 5 GP practices have closed, replaced by coffee shops. The argument was that cutting spending would make room for the private sector to grow. The increased economic credibility of the austerity plan would generally enhance the confidence of investors, businesses, and consumers. All of this pointed towards a hoped-for boost to the economy. The Chancellor at the time, George Osborne, said,
Sustainable private sector recovery built on a new model of economic growth instead of pumping the debt bubble back up. Part of the reason, as we have always argued, is that tighter fiscal policy can enable interest rates to stay lower for longer.
Cut government borrowing so interest rates on government debt fall, causing a general fall in interest rates across the economy, boosting borrowing in the private sector and therefore growth. Like in Greece, the UK government also wanted to reduce regulations to make the economy more competitive. Unlike in Greece, their policies would also lower our exchange rate to make our exports more competitive. This is the idea of expansionary austerity in a nutshell. It works by increasing confidence, primarily in financial markets, and therefore enabling investment and growth. Now, make no mistake, this was not as stark as Greece. The UK benefited from a number of factors, including our own currency, so that we could devalue and the Bank of England could buy government debt. This kept things from spiralling out of control for the most part. Borrowing costs were always low throughout this period. 2. A stronger starting point for the economy as a whole. Our economy was both larger and more diverse than Greece's. 3. Lower cuts, with some areas even safeguarded. Really, this was nothing compared to the dramatic package of reforms that we saw enforced on Greece. Yet, the experiences do rhyme. After the 2008 financial crisis, GDP dipped by around 6%. Historically, it was thought that recessions would be followed by rapid recoveries to make up for lost time. Easy to forget that you're supposed to catch up and grow fast after a recession. Instead, it took 7 years for UK GDP per person to reach the level it was before the Great Recession. In the decade leading up to the pandemic, GDP growth was about 2% a year, or only about 1% on a per capita basis. As this graph shows, we'd barely made any gains by the time the Conservatives got voted out in 2024. Had we returned to pre-crisis trends, GDP per person would be up by 20 or 30%. Wages have been even worse. Average weekly earnings in the UK have been stagnant since 2008, having dipped slightly following the crisis. This followed a good few decades of solid growth before the crisis. In the words of the Institute for Fiscal Studies,
This lack of growth in real wages is unprecedented in the last 200 years of British economic history. There has been no longer period without growth in real wages since the Napoleonic Wars.
if you know the IFS, you'll know they're not prone to hyperbole. At this stage, you may be able to guess the one statistic which defied expectations: employment. The employment rate rose over the austerity period, going from around 70% of the working age population to over 76% just before the pandemic. This was partly a result of the more robust economy and increased monetary flexibility that I referenced earlier. The central bank could do more in the UK. But it also makes sense when you realise that the cuts to unemployment benefits were pretty dramatic, as was the deregulation of workers' rights. This made unemployment more expensive relative to employment, while also reducing the bargaining power of employees at the same time. There was also a rise in immigration, which we'll talk about shortly. There was a big debate at the time about austerity and whether it would reduce growth and employment. Many critics of the austerity programs of the UK and Greek and other governments believed that cutting during a recession was a bad idea because it would suck money out of the economy, creating a vicious spiral where everyone cut back, reducing growth, investment, and employment. This was the main counter-argument against the idea that it would boost expectations and investment, sometimes dubbed the confidence fairy. Full disclosure, I tend to agree with this side of things, and I actually think that most economists did too. What's interesting about the results of UK austerity is that, while investment failed to crystallise and actually fell, employment was higher than the critics anticipated. Although this contradicted what proponents of austerity originally claimed would happen, high employment became a fallback statistic for them to boast about as vindicating their approach. Take, for instance, the Chancellor at the time, George Osborne, who not too long ago claimed,
and I would say the economic policies we pursued after 2010 meant that we actually had the strongest growth in the G7. More jobs were created under the Cameron government than any other government in British history. So we avoided that mass unemployment threat that looked very real in 2010. So I think there's a lot to be proud of what we did.
With mediocre growth, high employment and low wages, it seems that the UK has also succumbed to a low productivity economy characterised by insecure work. This has been called the productivity puzzle, and economists have been debating its causes for a long time. What I'd say is that these economists, along with both proponents and critics of austerity, have failed to appreciate the qualitative distinction highlighted in models like those of Arthur Lewis. Like Greece, we have seen a move towards something like informal or subsistence wages in the UK as a direct result of austerity. As the authors of a study at the Progressive Economic Forum put it,
There is, therefore, no convincing evidence in favour of Osborne's preferred argument for austerity. Instead, increases in output alongside stagnant productivity, caused by significant increases in employment in combination with falling wages, all point towards the labour market mechanism of austerity. In short, a large negative shock to bargaining power led to workers having no other choice than to work for lower wages. This led to increases in employment, which in turn maintained GDP growth.
Now, this isn't just happening to people on the edge of the economy. I should mention that I've been a fellow at the LSE, where 59% of academic staff are on fixed-term contracts. For research-only staff, it's 96%. That's not a typo. 96% of LSE researchers are on insecure contracts. The same people writing the papers about the labour market are themselves in the insecure sector. The dual economy is even affecting academia, supposedly one of the last bastions of secure employment. Of course, this is compounded for immigrants. I have colleagues who are on contracts for 1 year, and their status in the country depends on that contract. That's a lot to deal with. Now, being British, I don't want to be accused of being overly dramatic here. As I said at the start, the rise of the cafe economy has created a lot of benefits through third spaces, keeping high streets alive and improving British food. In addition, one of the great policy successes of this period has been the minimum wage, which has risen consistently, keeping many of those low-paid workers from dropping too far while not increasing unemployment because it doesn't do that. I have spoken about the Brazilianization of the UK quite a few times, and at one event, a Uruguayan guy came up to me and said that while he appreciated the idea, I had to realise, we're not there yet. We are just nowhere near Latin American levels of corruption, stagnation, inequality, and insecurity. Even Greece isn't. Still, it's rare for academics, trade unions, and business leaders to agree, but they have all agreed that the UK is stuck in an austerity doom loop. Spending cuts weaken the economy, leading to reduced tax revenues and higher debt, to which the response is yet more austerity.
Is there any answer I can give that won't result in more
Austerity?
No!
What we got wasn't expansionary austerity, it was exploitative austerity. A deliberate weakening of workers' bargaining power that forced more people into low-wage work, supplemented by immigrants who would be willing to accept such work. Some viewers might be thinking, well, why have you assumed that productivity and growth are the be-all and end-all? The answer is that obviously they are not. But there's a difference between engineering an economy that has low growth, but everyone is taken care of, works less, and the environment is protected, versus engineering an economy with low growth where much of the population is screwed over. The choice to pursue austerity or structural adjustment programs is a clear move in the latter direction, and it was just that, a choice. We chose to pursue policies that would push a lot of people into the subsistence part of the Lewis model. This is why food banks in the UK have risen at the same time that cafes have grown. In 2024 alone, the UK lost about 37 shops a day. There were 13,500 retail closures, up 28% on the year before. 2025 continued the trend. Poundland branches shut. Even Cancer Research UK closed around 90 shops. When the British institution Poundland and the tax-exempt charity shops are pulling out, you know things are bad. Unfortunately, it does feel like the political right are the only ones really drawing attention to the degradation of local communities. Reform UK has been campaigning for over a year on what they call a high street emergency, and research from Power to Change shows that Reform's popularity strikingly correlates with the state of town centres. The places hollowed out by austerity are the places turning to the right. Research by Timo Fetzer at Warwick showed that this also applied to the votes for Brexit a decade ago. They were higher in local areas more exposed to austerity. You'll also see people on the right argue that the UK has a low-growth economy, but that immigration is propping up the headline figures.
Problems with mass immigration is it's effectively been used in Europe to cover up the fact that our economies are not growing. Our economies are shrinking on a per capita basis. We are poorer per capita in this country today than we were before the financial crisis. And the reason we haven't had the policy of controlled immigration that people keep voting for is that bringing in more bodies is the only way politicians can pretend our economy is still growing.
I'm staunchly pro-immigration as a principle, but as a piece of analysis, this isn't entirely wrong. Immigrants are precisely the people who tend to fill roles like Deliveroo or Uber drivers, so they are not only quantitatively propping up the economy, they are qualitatively supporting the insecure employment model we have chosen. They bring us our McDonald's and take us home from our nights out, tolerating us looking out the window on the verge of vomiting the entire time. On the other side of the tracks, there has been a noticeable rise in the global middle class. This is perhaps best symbolised by the digital nomad visa, a visa many countries grant to people like me to go and live and work there as an influencer. It would be very cost effective for me to go to, say, Brazil with my current income. I could become a part of the global flat white economy, living on coffee and mangoes and powder queijo at a pretty low cost. Or I could go to Australia and live on coffee and beer.
coffee?
Beer.
In the novel The Kite Runner, the narrator Amir turns to Afghanistan after 20 years in America. He has been through a lot, fleeing his country when it was invaded by the Soviets, and now returning to rescue his newly discovered orphan nephew from the Taliban. He remarks to his driver Farid, "I feel like a tourist in my own country." Farid, who never left, eventually snaps at him for feeling sorry for himself.
He pointed to an old man dressed in ragged clothes, trudging down a dirt path, a large burlap pack filled with scrub grass tied to his back. "That's the real Afghanistan, Aha Sahib. That's the Afghanistan I know. You've always been a tourist here. You just didn't know it."
When I read this book a few years ago, this passage stuck with me, and it has become even more relevant since 2003 when the book was released. There is a real phenomenon of not just those with digital nomad visas being tourists, but the middle class of every country becoming one. Unfamiliar with what everyday life is really like for so many people, perceiving things like the cafe economy as just niceties while being unaware of what goes into it. One of the saddest things is that it's not like we can't have coffee shops without exploitation. As I pointed out, even increasing the pay of the poor farmers by an order of magnitude would barely register. There are plenty of cafes which use a cooperative model where they focus on things like procuring environmentally sustainable coffee, giving the staff a say, and providing spaces for the local community for things like childcare, which has also become prohibitively expensive. Incidentally, another way to support this channel is to sign up to Means TV, a cooperative owned by creators like me, where you can find all of our videos. Use my code for a 20% sign-up discount. Surprise, surprise! Unlearning Economics is talking about cooperatives again. Fight me, John the Duncan. I just wanted the end of this video to be optimistic. And I also like the country bit I've been doing. So... this place is known as Spain. They do a lot of things well, like seafood, La Liga, high-speed rail, anarchism, architecture and urban design, and just the best flag. They also do a lot of things not so well, like bullfighting, high-speed rail crashes, fascism, racism, and housing bubbles. One of the things that Spain has done recently that has gone largely unnoticed is to weather a very similar situation to Greece with a different approach. After the financial crisis, they also found themselves with a huge dip in GDP, high government debt, and on the periphery of the Eurozone. Spain had to go through a similar period of structural adjustment programs, spending cuts, public sector wage freezes, pension reforms, and labour market deregulation. Now, they already had a few advantages over Greece. First, they didn't have to make such a deep set of reforms. Their cuts were smaller. Second, they didn't have really specific conditions imposed on them like Greece, such as the credit default swaps not triggering. Third, they had a better starting point with a larger and more robust economy. But they still felt the pain. Despite having a government budget surplus before the crisis, Spain made cuts totaling 15% of GDP over this period. The reforms weren't as drastic as in Greece, but they were worse than in the UK. Growth fell over 9% from 2008 to 2013. Unemployment peaked at 27%, with youth unemployment at 55%. That is, more than half of Spanish youths were unemployed in 2013. Something changed with the government of Pedro Sanchez. He came into office in 2018, promising a reversal of austerity policies, and that's exactly what he's done. Firstly, they've invested in green energy, with the result that Spain now has some of the lowest electricity prices in Europe. They've brought electric vehicle manufacturing to the country, usually in partnership with German firms. Secondly, they have reversed a lot of the labour market reforms by raising the minimum wage and reducing insecure employment, with seemingly no negative effects on employment or wages. This goes completely against the framework of the free market Austerians, where over-regulating the labour market is supposed to hurt workers. One of their biggest successes has been their management of the pandemic. It would have been easy for such a crisis to derail Sanchez's reforms just 2 years into his presidency, but instead he doubled down. As the world came out of lockdown and experienced a cost of living crisis, they capped energy prices through the so-called Iberian exception. They also put controls on rents and subsidised public transport, with outright free commuter rail. The result was that Spanish inflation fell much faster than in most other countries. Spain went from having the 8th highest inflation in the Eurozone in July 2022 to the 2nd lowest by October. The Bank of Spain estimated that these measures alone shaved 2 percentage points off the headline rate. Of course, people still struggled given the circumstances. Wage increases were generally lower than inflation. But relative to most countries, Spain handled the pandemic pretty well. Following COVID, Spain is getting something like €163 billion from Next Generation EU, which is money the UK obviously isn't getting because Brexit. Next Generation EU is a big investment into the country of the type that we should have done all those years ago. And Spain also has a distinct approach to immigration. Sanchez has actually said out loud that migrants accounted for about a quarter of GDP per capita growth and 10% of social security revenue, while costing only about 1% of public spending. They're doing something more like targeted skilled migration into bottleneck sectors, not just shoving people into the low-wage gig economy. By 2025, Spain was the fastest growing major advanced economy, not just in the Eurozone, but in the world. Despite their spendthrift approach during COVID, their public debt has been falling recently. And above all, this generally favourable economic outlook has been accompanied by policies which actually helped the average person. Yet the fact that Spain has done pretty well recently has kind of flown under the radar. Often, when I highlight the positive policy decisions of a given country, I have a lot of people telling me that country has problems. I agree. Spain, for example, has relied a fair amount on the kind of tourism I've been speaking about, and is a prime location for digital nomad visas. Understandably, this has sparked a local backlash against tourism and led to political tensions. Spain's housing situation remains, as with most countries, pretty grim. But their government's actions and performance speak against any idea that there is no alternative to austerity. Austerity had predictably terrible effects for the Spaniards for almost a decade, but contemporary policy choices have partially reversed them even in the terrible circumstances of the COVID years. Unemployment is still quite high because these things don't get fixed overnight, but at least they're headed in the right direction. The lesson here is that a good economy with stable jobs that takes care of people is eminently possible, even in dire circumstances like a big financial crash when you don't have your own currency. It's possible that Arthur Lewis missed that a secure, productive sector is something that has to be actively created and defended. It doesn't just happen naturally due to development, and crucially, it's not always a one-directional process. Equally, it takes deliberate decisions to engineer a cafe economy which depends on insecure labour and tourism and reverses the process of development. It is the epitome of shallow and biased economic analysis to act like these trends are unavoidable and inevitable. It's the worst kind of economics, where the word is synonymous with tough times and hard decisions for other people, not the politicians and policymakers. In time, maybe we will learn to create a cafe-style economy that doesn't depend on ruthless exploitation. In summary, coffee good, austerity bad. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Hey, yeah, what's going on? Thanks for watching. Thanks to Sorsha for her animations and quote reading. Thanks to my editor Rosie. And thanks to all my patrons. This was a short UE video. It was really short. It was basically a reel. And there's going to be a much longer one soon. But then there are going to be more short ones. They're going to get shorter and shorter. And then eventually, it would just be zero. There won't be... See, this is what happens when I don't have a script. But I've got to keep talking as long as the patrons are scrolling by. Does anybody even care about the Patreon credits thing? I don't know. Do you understand how hard it is to do this on Premiere Pro? Like, for some reason, it takes as long as editing about 15 minutes of footage. Bye.